Anselm of Canterbury. May God so reign in your heart. August 2nd, 1100, England.
Overnight, a gentle rain had moved through the English countryside, but by sunrise the sky was clear and fresh. It was a perfect morning for a hunting expedition. The king's party, bows at the ready, urged their horses through the New Forest. William the Conqueror, King of Normandy, had invaded England in 1066. When he died, he had left the Duchy of Normandy to his son Robert, and England to his son William Rufus. The third son, Henry, had received only 5,000 pounds of silver. It was his third son, and the King of England, William Rufus, who now scouted the forest. A flash of brown crossed the path, plunging into the undergrowth on the other side. "This way!" shouted one of the hunters, drawing a bow. They plowed into the brush after the deer, trampling the tall grasses under galloping hoofs. "She must have gone into that stand of trees." "We'll flush her out," cried the king, turning in his saddle to face his companions. "Henry, take the others and cut over to the far side of the field. Walter and I will follow her into the trees." "As you wish," nodded Henry, but he turned with a wink to the king's escort. "Walter, keep an eye on my brother. The king is not as keen with a bow as he thinks he is." "I am far more skilled than you," laughed King William Rufus. "And even if I wasn't, who's going to stop me from taking credit for your shot?" He urged his horse forward and disappeared into the trees with Walter at his heels. The rest of the party skirted the woods, following Prince Henry toward the other side. They were only halfway there when they heard the zinging of arrows and Walter's shouts. "Come quickly!" cried Walter. "Hurry!" They rushed into the trees. Lying where he had fallen from his horse was the king. A scarlet stain was spreading out from an arrow buried deep in his chest. "My brother!" shouted Henry, leaping off of his horse. "What happened?" Walter threw himself across the king's feet, weeping. "We didn't coordinate our approach," he cried. "The deer ran out in front of us both, and we both drew our bows." "But the king, he wasn't paying attention. He rode directly into the path of my arrow." The men gathered around as Henry took his brother's face in his hands. "The king is dead," he declared quietly. "Take him home." His companions carried the king's body to his horse. Walter remained on his knees. "My lord, I beg you to forgive your servant. Your brother's death was an accident." "Do not blame yourself," said Henry, shrugging and snatching up the king's bow. "He was never an able hunter. It was bound to happen." "Oh, you are most gracious, my lord. Or should I say, my king?" Henry smiled and urged his horse into a gallop. He flew across the fields of Salisbury, leaving his companions to follow slowly behind, bearing their fallen king back to his people. Several weeks later, a group of clerics gathered at a table in a house in La Chaise-Dieu, France. We are grateful for your hospitality, Archbishop Anselm," said one of the visitors. "We have been anxious to see how you have fared since you have been away from England." "Time passes quickly when I am writing," replied their host. "I read your books as fast as you write them. They have opened the Scriptures to me in ways I never imagined." The Archbishop smiled. "How kind of you to say, Gundulf. Your method of proving God's existence is a challenge to any atheist." "It is a matter of simple logic," replied Anselm. If we can imagine a perfect God, then he must exist. If he doesn't exist, he is less than perfect, and therefore cannot be God. Bishop Gundulph chuckled. It is a puzzle to be contemplated on sleepless nights. The conversation was disrupted by a knock at the door. A man writing quietly at a nearby table set down his quill and answered it. 2 monks stood on the doorstep. We have an urgent message for Archbishop Anselm, said one. I am Eadmere, the Archbishop's personal assistant. What is the message? King William Rufus is dead, the man blurted. What? His Excellency was killed in a hunting accident. Henry is now on the throne. Eadmere quickly ushered the monks inside. Everyone at the table had heard their startling announcement. If Rufus is dead, your exile is over, said Gundulph, turning to Anselm. You can return to England now. A bittersweet victory, declared the Archbishop. Rufus and I were a young bull and an old sheep yoked to the same plough. We never saw eye to eye about matters of the church. I had hoped he would eventually change his mind. His shoulders drooped. Now we will never reconcile. Yes, but Canterbury can receive back her archbishop, Anselm sighed. He was tonsured like all monks, and sometimes the shaved part of his head itched. He scratched it. Exile has been a blessing in disguise. If I return to my duties in England, it will take far longer to finish my book on the Holy Spirit. Excuse me, friends. He rose suddenly and withdrew to the back of the house. Was it really an accident? Said Gundulph. Everyone knows Henry has had designs on the crown for years. The monks exchanged glances. I heard that the man whose arrow killed Rufus just received a large estate from Henry. The clerics broke into a flurry of whispers. With their brother Duke Robert away fighting in the crusade, it was a good opportunity for Henry to take Rufus's place as king. Shh! That kind of talk will get you exiled or worse. But Robert is returning to Normandy from the crusade. He has a new wife and great riches, and commands an entire army of knights. It is rumored that he has the power to reunite England and Normandy. Surely many of the nobles would support his claim to the throne. Perhaps, but England is tired of war. The nobles may prefer Henry to the tumult of another battle for power. They grew quiet. After a thoughtful silence, Gundulph said, The Archbishop seemed to take the news rather harder than I expected. He is a complicated man, replied Eadmere, and at his age, such news is a bit of a shock. He's not happy about returning to Canterbury. He never wanted to be Archbishop, you know. He was content as abbot of the monastery at Bec after Lanfranc left to become Archbishop. How exactly did Anselm receive the archbishopric anyway? The position had been vacant for several years after Lanfranc's death. Eadmere leaned back in his chair. King William Rufus chose not to replace Lanfranc, so he could use the profits from the archbishop's estates to fund his army. But the king became ill and soon feared he was dying. His advisers said God was punishing him for stealing from the church. He was, said one of the clerics. Careful, son, said Bishop Gundulph. Let Eadmere finish. Rufus decided to appoint a new archbishop immediately. At his insistence, the bishops of Canterbury invited Anselm to the king's bedside, supposedly to offer his personal counsel. Anselm believed the king was dying and rushed to Canterbury to pray with him. But when he arrived, Anselm noticed the archbishop's staff in the king's hand. He began to back away, but the king insisted. Anselm asked the pope to release him from the position, but the pope was pleased with the king's choice and refused to grant his request. Gundulph nodded. And then Rufus recovered from his illness. Yes, but Anselm's relationship with the king did not improve. Eadmir explained. Rufus had given much of the church's lands to other vassals. Anselm insisted that the estates belonged to the church and were his right to oversee. Only after long disagreement did the king return the land. When Anselm asked the king for permission to travel to Rome to visit the new pope, Rufus refused. Anselm persisted. Finally, the king granted him safe passage. But as soon as Anselm left, Rufus confiscated all of the church lands again, and Anselm was forced to remain outside England. But now that Rufus is gone, surely the archbishop will return. I will not be surprised if Henry sends an invitation immediately, declared Eadmir. The message arrived a few weeks later. The archbishop's lands had been restored. Anselm and Eadmir returned to England within the month. In spite of their anxiety about the new king, they found themselves smiling as the carriage whirled past the tidy English farms. The archbishopric of Canterbury was an enormous estate on the mouth of the river Stour. Surrounded by villages and fields, the heart of the estate was Canterbury Cathedral, and nearby, the archbishop's private residence. I pray that I can carry on my duties in peace this time, Anselm said as he set foot on his own soil for the first time in several years. Within days, the archbishop was called to an audience with Henry. He went immediately to Salisbury. Proudly displayed inside the court was the coat of arms of William the Conqueror, Henry's father. But the banners representing the king's house were brand new. Henry, wearing a bright blue brocade and his brother's crown, was deep in conversation with several courtiers. He smiled when Anselm was announced and waved them away, rising to greet his distinguished guest. "Welcome back, Archbishop." "Thank you, sire," replied Anselm. "I was grateful to receive your invitation to return. It is a proper beginning to your reign to promote the unity of Christ's church." "That is, of course, why I recalled you. I intend to fulfill my kingly duties to the church." "There is much to be done after these years of neglect." "And I will defer to your wisdom in those matters. But I have two immediate items of business." Anselm hesitated. He had an unpleasant feeling in the pit of his stomach. "Your return as lord of the church's estates in Canterbury obliges you to the same responsibilities as other nobles. Before I can receive you back into royal favor, you must pay homage to your new king." Henry shrugged. "I cannot make exceptions if I am to retain the noble's loyalty. I'm sure you can understand why that is a priority for me right now." It was a conversation like this with William that led to my exile, Anselm thought. "And the second matter of business, sire?" "You have been gone a long time, Archbishop. I have appointed 2 new abbots, and I need you to receive them into the church." Anselm sighed. "With respect, sire, I'm afraid I cannot comply with your wishes." Henry turned an unsmiling face on his guest. "These are simply standard procedures. You've done this before." The archbishop looked away. "You don't trust my judgment," declared Henry with a sarcastic laugh. "You think I murdered my brother, and my heart is too black to delve into sacred matters. Well, I assure you the new abbots are faithful churchmen. Actually, they are friends of yours." "I have no idea what color your heart is, sire, and I shall not presume to suggest that His Excellency King William Rufus died of anything other than an unfortunate accident. But that is beside the point." Anselm shook his head. "While I was away from Canterbury, I attended a council in Rome. The Church declared that investiture of clergy can be performed only by ordained bishops. Any lay person, no matter how high-ranking, who takes it upon himself to appoint clergy, and any clergy who receive the one improperly invested, are to be disciplined by the Church. That's ridiculous. The council reached the same decision about clergy paying homage. I am king of this land, cried Henry. Homage and investiture are my kingly rights, just as they were the rights of my brother and my father. Anselm was silent. Are you refusing to comply with my wishes? The king demanded angrily. It is not my choice to either refuse or comply, said Anselm. It is the decision of the Church. The council's authority is greater than the wishes of any man, whether archbishop or king. Henry clenched his fists and turned away. After a moment, he turned back with a calmer expression. Frankly, I need the Church's support during this time of transition. I will abide by the decisions of the council for now, but I suggest you give this more thought. Sire, enough business. It is time to introduce you to your soon-to-be queen. The king clapped his hands and called for his chamberlain. I believe you have heard of Princess Matilda. Anselm's jaw dropped. The daughter of Malcolm, King of Scotland? Don't look so shocked. It is a suitable marriage. She has royal blood, and an alliance with Scotland may prove to be an advantage. But Matilda has taken the monastic veil. She is a sister of the cloister at Wilton. Henry laughed. You do believe I have a black heart. She is not a nun. She merely lived at the cloister for a time. We are to be married in a matter of days. The princess was ushered in. She curtsied and took the hand of Henry offered her, but she avoided Anselm's gaze. The king frowned at them. I have taken enough of your time, Archbishop. I trust you will have reconsidered your position by our next meeting. Anselm was escorted outside. A dozen knights nodded with respect as he passed. Eadmer had been waiting at the carriage and now helped Anselm climb inside. Wait! Anselm looked down to see the princess hurrying toward him, her wide silk skirts swishing along the cobblestones. Please, Archbishop, a word. Eadmer raised an eyebrow, but remained in his seat as Anselm stepped out of the carriage again. She grasped his arm in both hands and looked at him with pleading eyes. Please, Archbishop, do not condemn me for marrying Henry. His reply was gentle but firm. Do your monastic vows mean nothing to you, daughter? My father sent me to Wilton with my Aunt Christina just to keep me out of his hair. He intended for you a life in the cloister. She shook her head, the shining ringlets across her forehead bouncing. He led everyone to believe that, especially after my engagement to Lord Richmond fell through. I know you wrote to the Bishop of Salisbury about me then, worried that I was running away from the church. But the truth is that my father planned a noble marriage for me all along. A man or woman who has voluntarily taken a monastic vow must never abandon it. You know I have no choice in this matter. My father has arranged everything with Henry, and I am an obedient daughter. Surely God honors such obedience. He frowned. This matter is not my concern. I have just returned to England, and I am already at odds with Henry. He looked into her earnest face and sighed. Seek the counsel of your chaplain, Matilda. I will pray for you. She squeezed his arm, still clutched in her small hands. Will you write to me after the wedding? I can ask for no greater honor than to receive your letters. It is the least I can offer the future Queen of England. He gently released himself from her grip and turned back to the open carriage. God be with you. The horses jerked into motion as soon as he was safely inside. Eadmir watched the princess through the window until they pulled away from the tree-lined drive, and then turned to Anselm. The archbishop was scowling at him. My first week back in England, and already everything is complicated, said Anselm. I made a disturbing discovery yesterday. About the king? No, about my assistant. Eadmir looked at him, startled. You've been keeping notes about my actions and things I've said, continued Anselm. Why? I'm just recording the details for the sake of history, like I did in my book about the life of St. Wilfrid. I have enough to think about without worrying what history will say of me. I want you to burn your notes. But, master, destroy them, Eadmir. You have more important tasks to do. Yes, master. The archbishop closed his eyes, as though he would nap. They said nothing more for the rest of the ride. Eadmir burned his candle until late into the night. After hours of leaning over his desk, he rose and regretfully tossed a manuscript into his fireplace. The flames had gone out, but the coals were hot, and the paper began to blacken and curl. With a small shovel, he picked out the charred remains and dropped them into a bin. I have obeyed my master and destroyed the manuscript he found, Eadmir told himself, and now I must sleep before he asks why I have been up all night. He blew out his candle and stretched out under a blanket. Below him, in the darkness under the straw mattress, was a stack of fresh pages, the ink still sticky. Across the top page, in his neat hand, was a simple headline, Life of Anselm. The following months were difficult. Daily services were re-established at Canterbury Cathedral. Anselm had time to write only in the evenings, and dedicated himself to finishing his books. Eadmir helped Anselm with a growing amount of correspondence. Occasionally, one was addressed to the Queen. Henry's marriage caused a stir throughout the country, but the alliance with Scotland had been a shrewd decision. The nobles began to show less support for Robert. Henry continued to add to his army as hundreds of knights returned from the crusade. The king regularly summoned Anselm to Salisbury, pressuring him to consecrate the new abbots and pay homage. Don't forget that I welcomed you back to England, Archbishop, Henry declared. Yes, and I am thankful you did, but it was your Christian duty. I also restored to you the church lands my brother confiscated. Yes, agreed Anselm, but again, that was your Christian duty. Henry slammed the table with his fist. I'm sick of these overbearing church procedures. Know this, anyone who tries to take away the king's rights is the king's enemy. Anselm raised his eyebrows at Henry's outburst. The king paused and collected his temper. I am a loyal subject of the king, Anselm insisted quietly. It is not my wish to take away your rights, sire, but even if it meant saving your life, I cannot and will not violate the commands of our church. Henry leaned forward and spoke in a more conciliatory tone. Then go to Rome and speak to the Pope on my behalf. Anselm blinked. If you thought you could change the Pope's mind, why have you not sent someone already? I had hoped we could work this out without bothering the Holy Father, But the dignity of my office as king is founded on the rights of investiture and homage. To lose them is a disgrace. You would send an old man all the way to Rome? You are the only one who can explain our disagreement to the Pope. Anselm sighed. If it is the king's command, I will go, for the sake of the Church of England. I hope you will not be offended if I also send a lawyer to be sure my rights are accurately represented. I assume you mean Lord William of Werelwast. Henry smiled and rose in dismissal. I commend you on your political awareness. William is a loyal friend. I am sure the two of you will have a profitable discussion in Rome. Eadmere accompanied his master on the long journey to Rome. Anselm tired quickly, and they had to make several stops along the way. By the time they arrived, months later, Werelwast was already there and had met privately with various members of the Roman Council. Pope Paschal welcomed his guest into St. Peter's Basilica. The Council of Bishops, eager to hear their arguments, sat in neat rows facing the Pope. Anselm and Eadmere were directed to seats on the right of the room, opposite Werelwast. For what reason does the English Church find itself in dispute with the English king? Began Pope Paschal. The king demands that I give in to his arbitrary demands in the name of justice, answered Anselm. But his demands are against the will of God. I ask you not to send me back to England until I can put the will of God before the will of men. Why does the king persist in this conversation? Asked the Pope. Werelwast cleared his throat. It is within the king's rights to choose his own bishops. Monarchs before Henry have done so without provoking Rome's anger. It is now an expectation of his subjects. The Pope looked at Anselm, but he remained quiet. Have you nothing more to say, Archbishop? Anselm lowered his head. I have already described the situation to you. I came here to seek direction, not to give it. I dare not presume to know more than the Council of Rome. Do you mean that Henry presumes to know more than Rome? Werelwast leaned forward. Henry is not setting himself against the Church, but the king's wishes, the wishes of a great man, should not be simply overlooked. The Pope did not reply, so he continued. A king is the ruler of his land. His rule will never be effective if his power is stripped from him. Not even to save his kingdom can King Henry give up his established right to invest bishops. The Pope drew in a sharp breath. Nor to save his own head will this Pope give in to any king's demands. The council ruled on this issue several years ago. If Henry invests bishops without the approval of the Church, he and those he invests will be excommunicated. The council murmured. Werelwast glanced at them, the corners of his mouth twitching. We have heard your arguments, said the Pope. Return to your king. The council will inform you of our final word by letter. Paschal is not a politician, Anselm told Eadmere as they prepared to leave. But there are quite a few of them on that council. They don't want a fight with Henry. They spent Christmas in Lyons rather than travel all the way back to England. Werelwast met them there. I bring a message from the king. That can be good, Eadmere mumbled under his breath. The lawyer ignored him. Before I left England, the king made it clear that you are only welcome to return if you pay homage and consecrate his bishops. We have not yet heard the council's decision. Until then, he can make no demands. Werelwast shrugged. If you refuse, he will seize your lands and revenues. Then I will not be returning to England, replied the Archbishop, shaking his head. Leave me. As soon as Werelwast departed, Anselm told Eadmere to get his pen. Take down the following letter. To the revered Lord Henry, King of the English, from Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, with faithful service and prayers. He paused, searching for the right words, and then began again. William of Werelwast will report to you on our meetings in Rome. I wish that I could assume the same relationship with you that my predecessor had with your father. But I cannot do homage, nor hold communion with those who have received investiture at your hands. I pray that you will allow me to return to England on these terms, with your peace and with the authority that belongs to my office. If this does not please you, I suppose that the loss of souls that may result in my absence will not be held to my account. He hesitated again. Is that all, master? Asked Eadmere. Yes. No, wait. Close it this way. May God Almighty so reign in your heart that you may reign forever in his grace. Anselm moved to the door and then turned back. Send the original to the king, of course, but make a copy and send that to my friend Gundulf, Bishop of Rochester. I don't trust that Werelwast. If he tries anything funny with the letter, Gundulf can verify that it came from me. There was no reply from Henry. Anselm wrote to him 3 times, demanding that he return the property. Matilda wrote to say that the king had received the letters, but he would not respond. She promised Anselm that she was pleading with her husband to relent. 2 years passed. An unexpected visitor arrived in Lyons in early summer. One of the Queen's ladies requests an audience with you, master, Eadmere announced to Anselm, who was busy writing in his study. Who is she? Adele, Council of Blois. Anselm looked up from his manuscript with eyebrows raised. The king's sister? Yes, master. He nodded and rose to his feet as she entered. Thank you for seeing me, Archbishop, said the countess. He took her gloved hand and led her to a couch. She folded back the lace mantle that covered her head, revealing wisps of graying hair at her temples. Her face was troubled. To what do I owe the honor of your visit? He asked. The Queen was thrilled to receive the book of prayers you composed. She wants you to know that she now uses them in her own devotions. I am pleased to hear it. Her smile faded. When I told Matilda I would be traveling through Lyons, she asked me to see you. She begs you to return to England. I have received her letters, he said, frowning, and I have already notified her of my decision. Won't you reconsider? I cannot. If I return, I would be forced to fellowship with the corrupt clergy who support Henry. But how long can this standoff with the king continue? Isn't there some way you can end it? I can excommunicate Henry myself, if he does not restore my property. Excommunicate? Henry is preparing to take Normandy from his brother Robert. If he is cast out of the church now, the nobles will withdraw their support. It would be a disaster for him. He has given me no other recourse. Please talk to him, Archbishop. If I can convince Henry to listen, will you agree to meet with him? He hesitated. I do not think he will agree. Leave that to me. She kissed his hand and, collecting her skirts, left as quickly as she could with the dignity of a countess. A month later, a message arrived from Normandy. The king had agreed to meet with the archbishop on the battlefront. Anselm set out with Eadmir at his side. Henry's knights had established their camp at an estate near the border town of Lagal. The grassy slopes were dotted with canvas tents, each one proudly flying Henry's banner. 2 horsemen escorted the archbishop's carriage past the smoky cooking fires and the makeshift corrals, where clouds of buzzing flies annoyed the horses. A large tent loomed at the center of the camp. Anselm stepped down from his couch with difficulty, feeling in his knees the aches of age and travel. His forehead was damp with perspiration under the July sun. He mopped it absently with his sleeve. "It is good to see you well, Archbishop." Henry stood at the entrance, where the tent's flaps had been tied open. He had left behind his colorful brocade and lace, and was dressed instead like one of his knights in a tunic of fine chainmail and leather leggings. Only the crown over his skull-cap declared his royal rank. Anselm nodded in a stiff bow. "You are kind to be concerned about my well-being." "I'll do more than that, and offer you some refreshment. Come inside." The ground inside the tent was covered by a large rug, with 2 chairs and a table at the center. Eadmir helped Anselm into a chair and then withdrew to a shadowy corner. Henry dropped into the remaining chair and poured 2 drinks from a jug. "I regret that I don't have much time to talk," the king began. "As you can see, we are preparing for battle. Normandy and England will soon be reunited." "At the expense of your brother's rule," replied Anselm. Henry's dark eyes flashed. "I did not ask you here to bless my invasion. The Queen and her ladies have been most insistent that I try again to reach a common ground with you." "The ground in question is my estate, which you have wrongly confiscated." "Any noble who neglects to pay me tribute will find himself in the same position." "I am not any noble. I am your spiritual father, and it is my duty to be concerned about the condition of your heart." "You find my heart so evil that you threaten to excommunicate me?" "You have forced my hand." "Excommunication is the severest punishment the Church can pronounce. Is that not for the Pope to decide?" "My property is my authority. It is not an issue for Rome." Henry glared at him across the table, but Anselm did not flinch. "You are the strictest man of principle I know," the king said finally. "I cannot afford to lose my support now. You win, Archbishop. If you promise not to put me out of the church, I will return your lands." "You are a gracious man, sire." Henry scowled and rose from his seat. "We still have other unfinished business," Anselm said. "Those issues are in the hands of the Pope, and I believe he sees my point of view." "The council has not yet ruled. It isn't wise to make assumptions." "I can spare no time to discuss this further. I have a war to win." He stalked away, but turned back at the entrance. "Give my greetings to the Queen and her ladies when you pass through Salisbury." And then he was gone. The Archbishop and his assistant left the camp immediately. "I assume we will be returning to England now that your lands have been restored?" Eadmir asked as they reached the main road outside of Lagal. Anselm shook his head. "I can't go back until the council clarifies their position on homage and investiture. Until they do, I risk my soul by praying and serving with clergy who have not been ordained properly." Eadmir located a house to rent in Normandy. Anselm was determined to wait out the council. Nearly a year passed before a sealed message arrived from Rome. "What does it say?" Anselm asked. Eadmir opened the letter and scanned it. A compromise has been reached, he said, the corners of his mouth twitching in distaste. In the interests of church unity, Henry will be allowed to demand homage from the bishops, but he is not allowed to invest clergy or he will face excommunication. Anselm sank into his chair. I had a feeling the council would allow politics to get in the way. The letter suggests that you interpreted the earlier decision of the council too strictly. I did no such thing. Eadmir said nothing. The archbishop scratched his bald spot. But Rome has declared the church's position, and I am bound to obey. It is a difficult ruling to accept, master. It is, but in a way I suppose it is good news. Henry will accept the compromise, so we will no longer be at odds. We will return to Canterbury? He nodded. We will return to Canterbury. Eadmir folded away the letter. The Queen will be pleased. Yes, and I can finally perform the duties of Archbishop in peace, like my master Lefranc did before me. He rose. Come, we have work to do. Within a week they set out for England again. This time their stay would be permanent. Anselm returned to England in 1106, but Henry was away for a year, invading Normandy. He captured Duke Robert, imprisoning him in Cardiff Castle, where the Duke remained until his death 30 years later. After Henry returned to England, he and Anselm agreed to a full reconciliation. Anselm spent the last year and a half of his life in peaceful fulfillment of his duties, for the first time since he had taken the office. He died in 1109. Henry waited 5 years before choosing a successor, in the meantime keeping the revenues of the estate for himself. After his master's death, Eadmir published his Life of Anselm. The book is now our most valuable source of details about the Archbishop's career.